Once upon a time, there lived a king who had but one son. Now, this son was called Prince Kindhearted. When the prince was 20 years old, he asked the king, his father, to let him go traveling, and his father fitted him out for the journey, giving him a true servant to guard him, and his fatherly blessing, of course. Now, the prince took leave of his father, mounted a brave steed, and went to different countries to see God's world. Now, he did learn many things, and he planned to return home wiser and a better man. Once the prince was slowly riding through a silent field, he was suddenly perceived by an eagle in pursuit of a swan. The white swan was almost caught by the eagle's sharp claws when the prince carefully aimed and fired his pistol. The eagle fell dead, and the happy swan came down and said, "Prince Kindhearted, I thank you for your help. It is not a swan that is thanking you, but the enchanted daughter of the King Invisible. You have not saved me from an eagle's claws, but from a terrible magician, King Koshé. My father will pay you well for your services. Remember, whenever you are in need, to say this three times. King Invisible, come to my help." The swan flew away as soon as it had finished speaking, and the prince looked after it, then continued his journey. He crossed many high mountains, traversed deep rivers, passed foreign countries, and at last came to a great desert, where there was nothing to see but sky and sand. No man lived there. No animal's voice was ever heard. No vegetable ever grew there. The sun was shining so brightly and burning so terribly that all the rivers were dried up. Their beds were lost in the sand, and there was not a drop of water for miles. Now, the young prince, anxious to go everywhere and see everything, not noticing how dry things were, kept going farther and farther and deeper into the desert. But after a while, he became terribly thirsty. In order to find some water, he sent his servant in one direction, and he himself went in another. After a long time, he succeeded in finding a well. He called to his servant, "I have found means of getting some water," and they both were happy. But their happiness did not last, for the well was far too deep, and they had nothing to which to reach the water. Now the prince said to the servant, "Dismount, I will let you down into the well by some long ropes, and you shall draw up some water." "No, no, no, my prince," answered his loyal servant. "I am much too heavy for you. Your majesty's hands will not be able to hold me. You take hold of the ropes, and I will let you down into the well." The prince took the ropes tied around him and went down into the well, drank the cold water, taking some up for the servant, pulled the ropes as a sign for the servant to draw him up again. But instead of pulling him up, the servant said, "Now listen, you kingly spoiled son. From your cradle days until now, you have lived a happy life, surrounded by luxury and love. I have always led a life of miserable wretch, serving you at every corner. Now you must agree to become my servant, and I the prince instead of you. If you will not exchange, say your last prayer, for I am going to drown you." "Oh, do not drown me, my true servant. You will gain nothing by it. You will never find such a good master as I am, and you will know what a murderer may expect in the next world. Let me suffer in the next world, but I will make you suffer in this one," answered the servant, and he began to loosen the ropes. "Stop!" cried the prince. "I will be thy servant, and you shall be thy prince. I will give you my word for it." "I do not believe your word. Swear that you write down you promised me. Now, for words are lost in the air, and writing always remains testimony against us. I swear." Now, the servant let down a piece of paper into the well and a pencil, and told the prince to write the following: "The bearer of this Prince Kindhearted, traveling with his servant, a subject of his father's kingdom." Now, the prince put the rope back up, and then the servant sat and glanced at the net. He nodded his head, pleased, and he pulled the prince up, switched out their clothes, and they went on. In a week or so, they came to the capital of a certain kingdom. When they approached the palace, the false prince gave his horse to the false servant and told him to go to the stable. He himself went straight into the throne chamber and said to the king, "I come to you to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage, whose beauty and wisdom are known all around the world. If you consent, you will have in our favor. If not, we will decide it by war." "You do not speak to me in a nice way at all, not as a prince ought to speak, but may it be in that your country you are not used to better manners. Now listen to me, my future son-in-law. My kingdom is now in the hands of an enemy of mine. His troops have captured my best soldiers, and now they are approaching my capital. If you will clear my kingdom from these troops, my daughter's hand will be yours as a reward." "All right," answered the false prince. "I will drive your enemies away. Do not worry if they come to the capital. Tomorrow morning, not one enemy will be left in your land." In that evening, he went out to the palace, called his servant, and said to him, "Listen, my dear, Go out to the city walls, drive away those foreign troops, and for this I will return you your note by which you denied your kingdom and swore to you be my servant. Now, the honest Prince Kindhearted put on his knightly armor, mounted his steed, and went to the city walls and called in a loud voice, "King Invisible, come to my help!" "Here I am," said King Invisible. "What do you wish for me to do for you?" "I am ready to do everything for you, because you saved my child from a terrible crochet." Prince Kindhearted showed him the troops, and the knights invisible whistled loudly and called, "Oh, you my wise horse, come to me quickly!" There was a rustling in the air, a thunder. The earth trembled, and the wonderful horse appeared, having a golden mane from his nostrils. Fire was burning from his eyes, bright sparks were flying, and his ears thick clouds of smoke were coming. Knight Invisible jumped on the horse and said to the prince, "Take this magic sword and attack the troops from the left, and I upon my gold maned horse will attack from the right." They both attacked the army from the left, and the soldiers were falling like wood, from the right like a whole forest. In less than an hour the entire army vanished, and some remained upon the spot dead. Some of them fled. Prince Kindhearted and the Invisible met King Invisible met upon the battlefield, shook hands in a friendly way, and then in a minute King Invisible and his horse turned into a bright red flame, then into thick smoke, which disappeared into the darkness. The prince returned quietly to the palace. The young princess felt very sad that evening. She could not sleep, and so she leaned out of her window when she overheard the conversation between the prince and the servant, and then she saw what was going on behind the city walls. She also saw that King Invisible disappear into the darkness. Prince Kindhearted returned to the palace. She saw the false prince coming out of the palace, taking the knightly armor from the servant. Prince Kindhearted entered the stable to rest. The next morning, the old king, seeing his land freed from the enemies, felt very happy. He gave the prince many rich presents, but when he announced the engagement to his daughter to him, she stood up, took the hand of the real prince, and helped to serve at the table, and led him to the old king and said, "My dearest father and king, and all of you that are present here, this man is my bridegroom, sent to me by God, for he is your savior, the real prince, and that one who calls himself the prince is a traitor, a false and dishonest man." Then the princess told everything she knew and said, "Let him show some proof that he is really the prince." The false prince gave the king the note, which was given to him in the well. The king opened it and read aloud, "The bearer of this note, the false and untrue servant of Prince Kindhearted, asks for pardon and expects a just punishment. This note was given to him in the well by Prince Kindhearted." "Is that really so?" cried the wretch as he became pale as death. "Yes, read it yourself. If you do not believe it," answered the king. "I cannot read," said the poor fellow. He knelt before his master and begged for mercy, but he received what he deserved. Prince Kindhearted and the princess were happily married, and it was present at the wedding, and also felt very happy.